Although they were bands that existed in different decades and periods of time, there are many similarities between the Beatles and Queen. 4 members, great records, historic live performances, and a legendary place in rock history. The legacy of these two bands always gives a place in the most privileged positions of the musical legacy of the 20th century. Unfortunately, the former members of the Beatles were rarely asked about Queen. Ringo had only a little comment about them, categorizing them as a great gang of boys. Harrison, on the other hand, stayed away, and Lennon and McCartney had some comments and approaches. In 1980, Lennon told the Playboy magazine that they'd stop being sentimental about the Beatles and that they would look at new bands, referring only to 2 bands, The Clash and Queen. And McCartney in the 80s tried to collaborate with Freddie Mercury, but in the end it didn't work out. Even so, he was close to the 4 members of the group, and they'd shared the same stage on some occasions. But considering the few references we have about the Beatles regarding Queen, we started to investigate the other side of the story. So today we present to you, what did Queen members think about the Beatles? Queen always had a great admiration of the Liverpool band, and much of his music was directly influenced by their work. They picked up the basics that the Beatles had pushed, and in the 70s and 80s, they took it to another level. One of the examples are the stadium concerts, and despite being the most famous band in the world in the 80s, they never denied their influences. So, thanks to interviews and documentaries over the years, it was possible to know a little about the opinion of each member of Queen about the Beatles. Freddie Mercury was influenced by the band. In the late 60s, his 2 favorites were the Beatles and Hendrix. A friend of Freddie's recalls, "We would all sit around and have an amazing vocal session singing the songs of the Bee Gees, the Beach Boys, and the Beatles. Even Freddie Mercury's pre-Queen band covered the song Rain, and fortunately, the record still exists." Chris Thompson said that Freddie's interest in connecting sections of Bohemian Rhapsody was influenced by A Day in the Life. Freddie had books with Beatles registers, and Brian May said he called them the Bible. Freddie mentioned in an early interview that his main influence to make this kind of song were the Pointer Sisters, but he mentioned the Beatles in different contexts. For example, Freddie admired John Lennon more than the other 3, but unlike his idol, Mercury never wanted to change the world. He repeatedly said that his job was to entertain, and that his main goal was to make Queen's fans satisfied at every concert, to make them happy after the show. "My songs are like razor blades. They're for entertainment, for modern consumption. People can throw them away later like used tissues." Mercury described Lennon as unique and special, but said he never felt the need to be so political. Freddie Mercury hated to analyze his songs in depth. "I like to leave that task to the audience." And in 1982, he released a song that was a tribute to John Lennon titled "Life is Real," with which he said, "When John died, and I wrote this song as a tribute, it was something direct from me to him. There is no comparison possible with anything he did or anything I did." Brian May in interviews often talks about his favorite bands and influences with deep respect. Among those groups were always included the Beatles. He describes them as heroes. For example, the Brian May School Band, 1984, did a lot of covers of Beatles songs like "Ate This Week," "I'm a Loser," "I Feel Fine," or "Chains," and on some occasions, he listed the Beatles as his favorite band. While preparing for his solo album, Another World, he talked about being inspired by the John Lennon song "Jealous Guy," stating it's the only song he would have liked to write in his life. In early 2000s, he made a personal top 10 of his favorite songs, and he listed "I Want to Hold Your Hand," "Hey Jude," and "Jealous Guy" among the songs he most enjoyed in his life. Also in his song "Rolling Over," from his solo career he quoted the opening riff of Day Tripper. On another time, he also said, I'm the biggest Beatles fan on earth. I would have even voted for every Beatles song you know. I was crazy about the Beatles and Cliff Richard and the Shadows. They were big in England." In that same interview, he was asked about George Harrison, who was already somewhat ill. Then Brian said this about him: "I've thought about George recently and I really wish him well. And just before he came over, was thinking about how the press treated Freddie when he was ill. You know? He literally couldn't get out of his door because of the photographers. They were even trying to get in through the windows, and there's absolutely nothing you can do. You have no protection. I've only met George once. We played together once. What a precious moment. I had a blinding migraine, but the moment overcame the pain. I wish I had had the balls to say what I really wanted to say at that moment. I hold George in such reverence, and I think he's very underrated by the guitar-playing community. Everyone praises people who play fast, but if you look at the catalog of stuff he has produced, it's colossal." Unlike Brian May, Roger Taylor has been less vocal about the Beatles, but neither has he denied the band's influence on his life. When asked if the Beatles had had a significant impact on his childhood, Roger refused. He said that the world was so saturated with the Beatles that it didn't hold his attention much, and so he opted for those years for The Who or the Yardbirds. But he says he went crazy about the Beatles after the release of Revolver. In another occasion, when he was asked about his songwriting work, Roger Taylor replied, "I'm not a Paul McCartney who goes up and writes a song before breakfast. He's trying to break the world record for songwriting." Roger covered the John Lennon song Working Class Hero for his Electric Fire album and talked about it in an interview. "I'm a big fan of John Lennon. I could have gone on talking about him forever. I think the Plastic Ono Band album was not a big hit when it was first released. It really is completely sublime. The song is probably not well known to the whole generation, so we decided to do a different kind of rock band version." Taylor referred to Lennon, Hendrix, and Dylan as his biggest influences, and later on stage, he covered With a Little Help from My Friends. John Deacon was less vocal than his bandmates. When asked who had inspired him to become a musician, he was blunt: the Beatles and other groups of the 60s. When Smile, the pre-Queen band, sent a demo to the Beatles' Apple label, the only comment they received was that Paul McCartney liked their logo. In another interview, John Deacon said, "We met Paul McCartney the other day, and it was great. He said hello to Roger and Brian. He was his hero from his teenage years. I must say, Junior's Farm was a disappointing single. McCartney has done a very good job. Band on the Run was very good. But going back to my earlier comment, I suppose he might be in some lab or something now if he hadn't been a musician." During the 80s, Queen did some Imagine covers on stage, and there were 2 or 3 other close-ups between band members. So we would love it if you would comment down here what other close-up comments or references you know of. That's all for now. Thanks for your time on this video. Subscribe to the channel and comment. This is Music Box.
Freddie always had a good voice. That's always been the anchor of that group, I think. And Brian's a good guitar player as well. You know, they've had musical skill. I think you can tell, you know, when a band's got musical skill.